right? Because if I'm being vulnerable, this is where my crisis of faith began. So conference. It was conference weekend. Now that we've gotten the housekeeping behind us, let's discuss. Some of our listeners may not be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so let me set a bit of the stage as it pertains to conference, and what general conference is. Remember, I went and actually during a priesthood session went and watched Jim Gaffigan downtown. And it was right across the street from the conference center in Salt Lake City. And it was so funny to listen to his jokes about general conference. And right at the beginning, he was like, man, I'm competing with general conference. He's it was just so many funny comments that he was making about, he's like, what do you talk about at general conference? Whatever it is, it must be pretty general, So, I mean, it was just funny to hear a perspective of someone who isn't of our faith try to describe what this general conference thing is. But on our church website, I mean, I don't need to read it word for word, but essentially twice a year, all of the membership of the church either gathers together at the conference center or watches online. The bulk of us watch online now. And it's the top leadership's council, for members of the church, and counsel, instruction, and people take it, very seriously. It's a very important time of the year to be able to hear, different instruction that might help us to better our lives. So that is a little bit of groundwork of what general conference is. And so we just wanted to touch on some of the topics that were interesting to us, maybe enlightened us, uplifted us, good messages there, as well as, talk about anything that might come across as controversial or be frustrating for some people, because I know that I hear both sides. You know what I mean? So if you open up your Facebook feed, you're going to have a million posts that say, man, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And you're going to have some posts that are going to say, I wasn't feeling this. So let's talk about all of that. Is there any one of you guys that want to start off by maybe mentioning some honorable mentions right here at the beginning? Zach, it looks like you've got something.
Yeah, I'm taking a deep breath into the microphone. So, I mean, let's just first off, we should honor the retiring of the angel Moroni as a symbol of the church. I mean, the guy drops a trumpet one time and it's like, wow.
You're done. I saw that meme. Great meme.
So that was interesting. So for those of you who don't understand that context in my brilliant humor, but basically the logo used to consistently be just the angel Moroni holding the trumpet. It's something that you see typically on our temples. And anyway, so now we've changed our symbol to the Christus, which is a pretty also iconic symbol. And I like it. I think it's certainly
I can't get behind it. I can't get behind it.
Can't get behind it, Bri?
Jesus freed the nipple. I think it's inappropriate.
You know what? And even our apps changed. I mean, that changed quick, right? So we have these apps and it used to be the angel Moroni with the trumpet, and within 24 hours that swapped over.
I do think it's interesting. So for the last year, the leadership of the church has mentioned that this conference is incredibly special, right? And, I think there's some placebo effect in that. I think that people who expected it to be special, it was to them. For me, going in with kind of a skeptical mindset, all I really saw was, great. We did further rebranding away from Mormonism to the Church of Jesus Christ. We created a proclamation to proclaim things that we already believed in, and so on and so forth. So, you know, kind of an interesting take. I think it, you know, the placebo effect is alive and well in the fact that those who went in hoping to have a special experience did, and those who didn't probably didn't. So
I will say, in addition to that, I think that there is some value in that way of thinking as it pertains to going into any type of meeting or new job or anything. I feel like if you feel like it's going to be great, usually you can make it great. So I feel like that it may come across as negative, but also that could be a great positive. And I think, Zach, you had put in a couple quotes from President Nelson, I don't know, making some comments right at the beginning. Did you want to talk about those?
Yeah, I'll jump right into that one. So, I mean, I think it is interesting. And I think when somebody says something, there's a million different ways to interpret it. I think that President Nelson, at least in the conference before this one, did say that it'll be, you know, memorable and unforgettable were some of the key words that he used. And in his opening remarks, he said, "Little did I know when I promised you at the October 2019 General Conference that this April conference would be memorable and unforgettable, that speaking to a visible congregation of fewer than 10 people would make this conference so memorable and unforgettable for me." So I think it was interesting that he, you know, right off the bat said, you know, I said that it would be memorable and forgettable, but I didn't envision it this way. And I know that there were probably some people, I know I had the thought that, you know, he said it would be memorable and unforgettable, and now we're in the middle of a pandemic. It was the first ever conference that was socially distanced, and it was odd. It messed with the timing of all the jokes in the talks. Like, they would say a joke and then they'd pause, the obligatory, like, for all you people at home who thought that was great, now's your time to laugh, and then I'll proceed with it. So it was kind of interesting to kind of see that change. The cadence didn't change in terms of how they talked, but the context and the environment was totally different. But yeah, so it was interesting that he talked a lot about, you know, that there was a lot. He obviously acknowledged the pandemic. It's a huge issue. Everybody's affected by it. And so everybody in the church with a believing heart is interested to see what wisdom he would disperse to us. And it was interesting because he did compare the need for physical financial preparation, emergency stores, with the need for having spiritual storage. He said, equally crucial is our need to fill our personal spiritual storehouses with faith, truth, and testimony. We pray that this conference will be memorable and unforgettable because of the messages you will hear, the unique announcements which will be made, and the experiences in which you will be invited to participate. So I think he kind of there in the opening remarks kind of explained how he envisioned it being memorable and unforgettable, but that it was still dependent on us individually. So to address what Brian had said, and then I'll hand it off to whoever wants to say something. I mean, as a member, I've definitely gone into conferences where I had that optimistic thought, and it came out a dud for me. So despite my placebo, I wasn't getting the results. There have been plenty of times when I came in with a negative mindset, and of course came back with nothing. And then in between the spectrum, where, you know, I maybe was surprised by something shared and had an experience that I would describe as outside of myself. But so yeah, I think that it's definitely interesting to see the different reactions, even if it's just within the church, for people and what they got out of conference.
Yeah. Jordan, did you have any comment on this?
Yeah, just to Zach's last point, and Brian's, there is somewhat of a placebo. I mean, you could call it placebo, or you could call it being more vigilant to what you want to expect or what you want to experience. I always find that if I'm looking for some good things, and this is what happened in this last conference, if I'm looking for some depth, I find it. But I also, every conference, and maybe I should avoid doing this, I don't know, but I also tend to be a little bit, it's not skeptical, negative, I guess, regarding the kind of cultural repetitiveness, kind of I wouldn't say vain repetitions, but you could say maybe a little bit, because there is a certain cadence of voice particularly in certain, I don't know, Relief Society circles. And then there's also kind of a repetitiveness among the 70, I think, a little bit more. But when I actually pay attention to the words and try to push aside that cultural, Utah accent, I do find that there is some depth in a lot of what is being said. And so that's kind of my approach and my very basic overall observation of the same thing happened this conference as it usually does.
Yeah.
So I didn't take notes or anything.
Come on.
I know. It's terrible. Kind of funny. I actually used to think that, you had to take notes or else like you're not paying attention or something. And then I stopped taking notes and I started getting more insight, just because I'm listening to actually what my mind clings onto or my spirit clings onto. And I think it helps to not take notes, to be quite honest, for me.
I did appreciate right at the beginning President Nelson's candor, at least willing to kind of put to bed probably a lot of the things that he was seeing swirling around, Facebook. I know I saw on my Facebook, there was a big one that went around. Isn't it amazing that at this particular time, the prophet said this would be a special conference, and suddenly, this is what, people essentially making claims that he maybe foresaw the pandemic, foresaw that no one would be at conference, foresaw like certain things. And it was nice to hear his candor of essentially, I had no idea. Well, he didn't say those words specifically, but little did I know that this is how this would be. But I meant special because of the things that hopefully will change you, the words you hear, and, rather than focusing on some kind of physical prophecy that he knew exactly what the conference would be. So I appreciate that kind of candor.
I also know, as a side note to that he was actually planning on something completely different this conference. There was going to be more of a performance, like dancing, singing, a lot more of that, and rather than just addresses or talks.
Oh, interesting.
I happen to know that from a guy that we went to high school with, that his dad works for the church fairly high up. So he just he told me that they were planning on that, and that was kind of what was planned as a very different conference that would be memorable, and then turned out it was memorable in a completely different way.
Right. Brian, you started to make a comment and then you got cut off there.
What I was going to say is, to be honest, my memory is about 10 seconds long and have no clue what I was about to say. So, do have some just kind of general thoughts. So, General Conference has always been kind of going back to the shame and guilt conversation. General Conference has always been kind of a hard thing for me to experience. And I don't know if it's just my ADHD, but asking me to sit for 10 hours and listen to, the comment about General Conference being general, right? Jim Gaffigan, there is some truth to that, because just about everything discussed is extremely basic and fundamental, which is good. I think for a large, percentage of the people participating. For me, it is absolutely terrible, because I can't listen to, there needs to be some variance, something new for me to pique my interest. So that's something that's always kind of troubled me, is that, General Conferences has always been a time where I've just felt guilty, because if other people are, having such great experiences and I can barely get myself to not take a nap, during that Sunday afternoon session, then, that means there's something wrong with me. So, luckily I don't, experience that guilt anymore in relation to General Conference, but it's kind of always been a tough time. So
I wanted to hear from you, Brian, though, this, your favorite phrase that you put inside of the outline here.
Yeah.
Go ahead and read it and tell me what your thoughts are, and maybe we can discuss that for a second.
Yeah. So, coming from a kind of former believer, now mostly kind of agnostic when it comes to religion. General Conference still has some very great principles that add value to a lot of people's lives. And one of the comments, and it was, I can't remember exactly who it was. I think it was a 70 in the first session of Saturday morning, who said something about something along the lines of, it's not important that our children make the right choice. It's that they choose to make the right choice. So I thought that was very wise, just, from my experience and my parents' experience growing up I've got friends who grew up in homes where they, didn't have the ability to make their own decisions until they went off to school, and all of a sudden they were staying up every night till 4 a.m. and had a tough time. So yeah, I thought that was a great piece of parenting advice, that forcing your kids to make the right choice is not the desire. It's not the end goal. It's to help your kids choose to be making the right choices, essentially. So yeah, I thought that was interesting and wise.
Awesome.
And I, in some ways, was one of those friends. I remember after we graduated from high school, my parents pulled me aside and they're like, "Zach, you're a man now," basically. And they're like, "We just want you
I
to
didn't
know."
want to say it, but
Yeah.
he
And
was
they're
one
like-
of them. Yeah.
They're like, "So you know what? You don't have a curfew. You can, stay out as late as you want. You can do whatever you want." And I remember, Brian was probably one of the most responsible people that I have ever
by
met,
far.
even at a very young age. Because I remember we'd be hanging out late at night, and sometimes it would just be me and Brian, or it would just be a smaller group. And Brian's like, "All right, I'm going to go to bed now." And just because I could stay up, I wanted to stay up, and I would resist it so much because I was just like, "But Brian, we're free. We can do anything, man. What are you doing? Go to bed." And he's like, "I need sleep. I need to rest. I need to take care of my body." And I'm like, "But dude, free." And no, Brian was very disciplined, and I was one of those people who, maybe not to the same degree as others, but certainly to a degree, I had no idea how to handle some new elements of freedom that I had access to at a later stage in my life.
Yeah, Brian definitely was. I don't know how you did it, Brian, but you've always been responsible. All right, well, let's jump into some of these talks, unless there's any other general comments. Oh, I did want to make, before we jump in, I did want to make a comment that I did notice. There was a few talks talking about, and they didn't use these words, but people being challenged with their faith, people being challenged going through, faith journeys or faith crisis. And there was reference to that. And there was some commentary that I really did appreciate. Having been someone that's gone through, some kind of faith progression or faith journey, there was commentary that I appreciated, and it felt loving, a more loving and understanding approach than maybe something I've heard in the past. So anyway, I wanted to make commentary to that. If there's anybody that is going through, difficult faith challenges right now, there may be some valuable talks you may want to listen to or read, and hopefully they build you up.
Yeah,
Anyway.
a quick follow-up comment to that. So, it's interesting, there are a couple of different reactions when people hear that you're going through a faith progression or some type of change in belief. One is, and I think my wife has this approach where it's just like, look, everybody's got their journey, who's to say that your journey is wrong and mine is right, or something like that, right? So there are those who are very open about it, and are curious, right? Ask questions. Why are you going through what you're doing? And I just love that, right? Several people in my ward, knowing that I am, have had changes in belief, have been very open and just kind of, want to come over and ask questions and understand my journey. And then there are others who look at someone who's gone through kind of a loss of faith or a change in their belief structure, and the whole conversation is around them being broken. You're I'm sorry that you're going through this trial or this challenge. And for me, I would phrase it as kind of an awakening, right? I think I'm more whole than I've ever been in the past. And so I don't know, it's hard to see those reactions from some people who, think that I'm a skipping CD that no longer plays the intended track.
Yeah.
I think that's great to bring that up. Go ahead, Spence.
No, Zach, I want you to jump in.
Yeah, and I thought that was you sharing that element of shame of just not feeling what other people were feeling. I think is such a much more commonplace experience in so many venues of life. I mean, not to use an example that maybe doesn't resonate, specifically, but I mean, like Joseph Smith said that he wanted to have the visions and the experiences that people were having, but he couldn't. And I've certainly had moments where elements of the gospel that people were just like all about, it didn't hit me at that point. And I think, we all go through different developments. I like what your wife shared, that, we all have our journey. And I mean, even from a believer's perspective, somebody who maybe, from where I'm sitting, like I want people to feel what I have felt. And I understand that I can't force that and that everybody has their agency. And I'm not in charge of somebody's destiny except I try to do my best with my own, right? And we just hope to have the opportunity to witness, authentic experiences and share those authentically. I do think it's interesting, though, that there is utility in repetitiveness, like to get something from the conscious level to the subconscious level. And I think that's definitely a strong element in the church and in the gospel. And interestingly enough, during one of the podcasts with Eric Weinstein, he actually shared how he viewed the Passover as valuable. And I mean, this guy is I'm pretty sure he's an atheist, but nevertheless shared. He said, we're coming up on Passover, and we Jews have a tradition that I wish everybody had, which is that we read one stupid story every year just to drill it into your head to make sure it's always fresh. And this is when it's time to leave, when it's time to change, don't wait for the bread to rise. This is what I say to every Jewish person. You're sitting around waiting for the bread to rise because they all know the story, which is you eat the matzah because the people who waited for the bread to rise are no longer with us. Their descendants are no longer with us. So just the utility of just drilling things in, keeping it fresh for any, if you've come across any sort of intellectual property that you find valuable and you truly do feel that it's important, then, I mean, willfully or sometimes subconsciously, we're going to continue to feed that. And that's a part of us building up our worldview, I think. Before we jump into the thing, I did also thought it was interesting, guys, a temple in Dubai.
Oh yeah.
Is the Angel Moroni going to be made out of just diamonds? And like, is it going to be like a network of like temple places where you get like driven in Lamborghinis that are like limo Lamborghinis, like two different sections? Like,
I was hoping
they're made of gold.
Yeah, I was hoping that they'd buy the top 2 floors of the what's that building?
Burj Khalifa.
Yes.
Yeah.
That'd be so unreal, dude. You just see a Moroni on the very tippy top of the tallest building. Like,
I know.
They shoot like a, what's it called? Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible. They shoot a sequel and Tom Cruise is back on there and you just see this like awkward
and then the trumpet
like,
falls
in the
and
shot.
he like catches it. Pulls it out.
That'd be an amazing crossover. So huge.
Yeah.
Scientology, Mormonism, it can't get better.
It'd be incredible. All right, Jordan, did you have any comments you wanted to make on anything before we jump into the main discussion?
Real quick on Zach's point of repetitiveness. There's something that I've thought about a lot in the last week, and it's how, because I asked myself, why does the church repeat so much? And Brian talked about this last time. And the thought occurred to me that there are certain stories, certain wisdom literature that have enough profundity that upon repeating it, you realize that there's different levels, there's varying levels, and you can learn something. It may be poor exegesis, but you can learn something every time if you're looking for it. Perhaps that's placebo, but I think that, just kind of like you watch the movie Inception, like for the sixth time, and you find something else new, for example. And I think the same thing goes, not necessarily often for all general conference talks, but for things such as this new proclamation, there are certain phrases that I had never thought about before. And then I read it again, and it's like, oh, that's interesting too. So repetitiveness sometimes can have its merits. And that was all I had to say before we jump in.
Awesome. So we're gonna start with you, Brian. This talk by Joy D. Jones, Sister Joy D. Jones. Do we know if she's the primary president?
Primary president.
Okay. She's the primary president. This talk was entitled "An Especially Noble Calling." So Brian, I'm gonna let you take the reins from here and kind of launch us into a discussion. But before we do that, the topics we picked out here, some of them may be a little bit, these are topics to wrestle with, right? So this first one is, talking about women in the priesthood. I'll talk a little bit about, blacks in the priesthood as we go along. And then we're also going to be talking about the atonement and things like that. So there are some interesting discussions to be derived from these topics. Don't be initially turned off by, difficult challenges that we may present. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. So in relation to Joy's talk, I also think that Dallin H. Oakes talked about the priesthood as well, women in the priesthood as well. I don't really want to share my personal experience here, but several women close to me are just extremely dissatisfied with the answer that they keep getting, that women have the priesthood already and have the ability to wield the priesthood to direct their families, and being essentially told, it reminds me of the Office episode, the episode of The Office where Jim comes back and is now the number 2 to Michael, and Dwight's like, does he make more money than me? And Michael's like, it's not more or less, it's just different. Of course, Jim was making more money, but I feel like that's the reaction that many women who struggle with this have, is they're being told, oh, you have everything that men have. But wait a second, if my husband doesn't believe in the church, can I then bless the sacrament in my home? Well, no, you can't do that. Okay, well, if my husband doesn't believe in the church, can I baptize my son when he's 8 years old? No. Well, no, you can't do that either. So I just know that there is some dissatisfaction with the answer of, oh, women, have the priesthood, but different, not just that, but, struggle with also a lack of representation of women in the scriptures, and feeling less than, right? And I empathize very strongly with that, coming from a home where, it makes me grit my teeth every time that, priesthood leaders come over from the ward and meet with, me and my wife, and look at me and say, Brian, as the leader of this home, can you choose who says the prayer? And, every time I hear that, I'm like, Carly is in charge of this house. Like, I am not in charge here. Stop asking me, So I'm not the expert on this. We'd love to have one or several women come on and share their experience if this is a struggle that they experience as well. But yeah, just want to highlight that it's a reoccurring message that's happening. And I think there's a lot of general dissatisfaction with being told that they're the same, but different.
To add a little more to the base of what you're saying, Brian, because I've had a few conversations in preparation for our discussion tonight as well, with several people in my life, and I will say that there is pain around that topic for some women, for a lot of women, and I do hope that we can get we can get some women on here to discuss that, because I feel like that would be totally invaluable to be able to hear their perspective, because their perspectives are different than ours, and probably better than ours. But I want to add that I have felt, as I've listened to talks about the priesthood in general, and I spent a lot of time, if people don't listen to I'm going to do another podcast promotion here, but if people don't listen to the Faith Matters podcast, it's fantastic. It initially started with Terrell and Fiona Givens, and they're just incredibly intelligent members of the church, very thoughtful members of the church. And there was a talk, a recent podcast about the priesthood power of women. That was the title of the podcast. Let me just say, I do wrestle with this topic a lot, because I feel like the message is shifting, and part of me celebrates that and says, that's it, right? Living church. We are a living church, and we can begin to interpret the priesthood differently over time. And I understand that, and I celebrate it, because I do want to see progress in that space. But part of it makes it, for me, feel I get lost in the discussion. The priesthood used to feel really simple. A man held the priesthood, which is the power of God given to man, and he can perform specific ordinances for the salvation of mankind. And now it feels like if you say a prayer, you're exercising priesthood power. So then it became a very general, it felt very broad, and I was like, what is the difference? What's the defining difference then? What are we talking about? I get kind of lost. So someone who's more profound than me, maybe, and Brian, you go ahead and add what I'm saying.
I think a lot of the shift is cultural. I think a lot of it's cultural pressure. I know some women who have been called into, church headquarters and been asked, like, what are you struggling with as a woman in the church? And I think that the church is receiving a lot of pressure for being a sexist organization, which I think there's some merit to that conversation. And if this happens, which I strongly believe it will, and we can reference this quote whenever it happens, I think it's only a matter of time before the church gives women all the priesthood power that men do. And at the time, it's going to look, in my opinion, probably very reactive, right? That there was enough cultural pressure to keep the church alive and well. I think it's just a matter of time. I do know someone who has the hypothesis, the scripture that's the first shall be last and the last shall be first. How Eve was the first one to partake of the fruit, and she was the first, and so women are going to be the last to get the priesthood. And interesting thoughts.
Interesting thoughts. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I saw an interesting video during conference weekend, and my words will be short because I think I'm definitely in over my head, both in study and primary experience, since I'm not a woman and I haven't studied. And most of my exposure to women's thoughts on this have been positive. And I'm sure that it should be noted that there are some women who have positive views about this distinction in roles, not just in the church, but in life. And I think even, in secular conversations, there's still a consistent conversation about perceived biological differences that, we're not the same. Again, you can extrapolate whatever you want from those differences and make claims about what that means. I mean, anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's in most cases. But so I'm just not going to try to get into that until maybe we have some more study. And then, like Brian said, I would love to have a conversation with some women in the church or outside the church and just be able to hear more about their perspective. But But there was a video that talked about one person's journey from a crisis of faith. And at the end, he just shared Articles of Faith number 9. And I haven't thought of Article of Faith number 9 in years, but to me, it was kind of profound, where he just shared that it says, we believe all that God has revealed, all that he does now reveal, and we believe that he will yet reveal many great and important things pertaining to the kingdom of God. And he highlighted the 2 words, great and important. I mean, this isn't just going to be, ancillary things like changing up words in a scripture. I don't know.
The nipple Jesus logo.
Sure. Yeah. It could be, stuff like that. Yeah. Maybe some like rebranding, and we could call it inspired rebranding, depending on how you see it. But that many great and important things can be revealed that haven't been yet. And it's been said that the restoration is still in process. And again, that can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. But, from that perspective, that's adequate for me in saying that there's still more to learn. There's still more to discover. And it may be stuff that was in what we know as the 2/3 of the Book of Mormon that was sealed. Maybe women had the priesthood back in the day. I don't know.
Right.
What was it? Esther was a prophetess in the Old Testament. I mean, so we have these
the
examples.
one example that we can look to.
I mean, one is better than none. That's all I can say. But we'll just. I mean, I think that's all I have to say about that for now.
Jordan.
Well, first off, I'll introduce Trisha. This is Trisha. We're having the discussion about feminism, equal rights, and the church's stance on priesthood and whether or not women should have the same role, I guess, as men currently possess in the church. Something that my grandma expressed, I think it was a few years ago, and she's always had this same opinion. She just recently died, by the way. As many know, she was one of the more prominent entrepreneurial businesswoman figures in like the entire world, right? And so she knew Oprah personally. She knew, Larry H. Miller. She's a very, very influential figure, and very much a boss. She was like the matriarch of many, many people, and not just our family. And something that she said, interestingly, about the church and our church's position on the priesthood was that she was all for the separation of those roles, but something that would bother her, surprisingly, was when women and men would get up in general conference and say things like, and women, you have a special role as well, and she would express those thoughts as frustrating because she was like, I never questioned that we didn't have a role that was equal to men. So why are they coming out now during all this feminism pressure given by society? Why are they coming out and saying, and women, you are just as important as the men, almost in a condescending way? Because my grandma always felt like in the church and according to the doctrine that everything was equal. It was different, but equal. And so that was a frustration that she expressed. Although the whole time she also felt like the distinguishment of the roles and the men holding the priesthood for making those ordinances and giving blessings, etc. She appreciated those differences. So, but yeah, I'd like to, maybe pass some time over to Trisha because she's having a visceral reaction biologically to some of the things that particularly Brian was saying. So
sorry, can I just put some boundaries, Trisha, as a man, to tell you what you can and cannot say as a woman on this podcast? That's a total joke, by the way.
Authoritative, yeah.
I was waiting.
The patriarchy has spoken.
Oh.
Now it's your turn.
Oh, thank you. So, I've been doing a lot of research on the family and proclamation to the world. That's along the lines of what I'm studying. For school, I want to be a marriage and family therapist. I particularly want to be a sex therapist. So recently I was looking at the difference between equal and identical. And the world is kind of equating the two, that they're the exact same. That if to be equal, you must do exactly the same things. And that is really challenging because we do have divine roles as men and women. And I'm really confident in my role as a woman, and I know that there are people who struggle with this issue a lot, and I haven't been one of them. So I feel like in a lot of ways it's hard for me to address this topic.
And maybe we can go into that with somebody that's on the opposite side of the spectrum, but obviously Trisha is more on the side of what the church's current stance is. So carry on.
I have the opportunity, well, not right now, but when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, to serve in the temple as an ordinance worker. And I feel like that's given me a unique perspective to being able to participate in all of the ordinances of the priesthood and not feeling limited at all. Every time I'm serving, I just feel such like an overwhelming like respect for the priesthood, and a respect in return for my Father in heaven, of just like this gratitude.
Yeah. So quick thought, and I totally agree with you, Trisha. You know, there is a difference between equality and equal versus identical.
Identical.
Right? And you know, I think, you know, from a social perspective, you know, the left, right, socially has you know, the identity politics says that, you know, there's no biological difference between men and women, and obviously that's, you know, not true whatsoever. So I do think I think that's true. You know, equal and identical, we, you know, men and women don't need identical, but identical capabilities and identical rights, essentially. So I agree with that, and I acknowledge that, but I think that a lot of women still don't feel equal.
Why do you think that they don't feel equal? Because I'm not sure, from my weird perspective as a man, which is weird. Yeah, why do they not feel equal, do you think?
On a lot of different issues, that I think not even just this like gender equality situation, like people have a lot of misunderstandings of the doctrine, and that those become like a cultural norm, and then those are the areas where the people are really struggling. Because if they looked at the doctrine and they really allowed that to like seep into their heart, then I don't think that they would struggle with it as much. And maybe that's too bold of me to say, but
how do you tell a woman that she's equal when there is one story, maybe two stories of women in the scriptures, you know? And the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 make decisions about the church, and I know this because, you know, my mom does a lot of research on this. Men tend to make better decisions when women are involved in the decision-making process, right? So how do you tell that they're equal when they don't have a seat at the table and there's virtually no representation of women in the scriptures?
I think that's an interesting thing. And I feel like I'm definitely in deep water here. But
We all are.
yeah,
yes, very much so.
I would say it's almost like, because you don't see stories of women on paper, you feel like that discredits any impact that women have had in these stories. You know, we know that Lehi had a wife. I assume that like Alma, in order to make Alma the younger, he needed a wife, or, you know, and so I know that I'm bordering on saying like, you're this powerful, quiet influence in the background, and isn't that wonderful? but I am just saying, like, it doesn't take that much thought to imagine that there's no way that that women have not played a significant role in any person's life. I mean, I was raised by a stay-at-home mom, so it would be impossible for me to try to trace every single element of my personality, good and bad, that has been impacted by her. You know, for better or for worse. You know, however I impact the world, I know that, you know, she's had a part to play in that, and my dad too, like equally, you know, in different ways. I don't know if this is an adequate or sufficient answer for women who have these concerns, and I'm not trying to solve those problems, but is it really that hard to imagine that women have had as strong of an impact in the story of religion?
Well, imagining something is not the same as reading the actual story. So saying that that's
Sure.
equal is also, I think, just as bad. You know, from my experience, right? I guess an example in the workplace, right? You know, I'm in sales and have been at software companies for the last 10 years, and, you know, kind of progressed to kind of the upper end of sales, and, you know, never thought about the fact that, you know, most of the people doing what I do kind of look and act exactly like me until, you know, I spoke with a friend of mine at my company who's, you know, an Asian woman of Asian descent, who shared the struggles that she had at our company because, one, she doesn't see very many Asian people at our company and doesn't see very many women progressing the kind of sales team, which she hopes to do. So I don't know. I think, yeah, again, our viewpoint is probably not the right one to have, but again, I imagine that answer of, oh, well, you know, we know that Sariah was important on Nephi's life, even though she was, you know, portrayed as a hysterical woman who lost faith and, you know, didn't completely believe in her husband the whole time. And, oh, but she was important too. And, you know, we can learn just as much from her story. I think that's a cop-out.
Trisha, I want to hear from you again. Are there any like final? I mean, we're totally missing the mark as as men, and we always miss the mark. Men do, but any final perspectives that could kind of glean more light in a better way than we can on this? I'm asking hard questions.
Yeah.
I could get a little bit more specific if that's okay, because I don't think we want to spend, you know, our entire podcast on this, and we probably should wrap it up so we can get to the other points. But given the fact that in the last few years the church has responded to the, I guess you could say, social feminist call of equal rights by suggesting that the women have access to the priesthood, whether or not they actually have the priesthood holding power in their home. I'd like to ask Trisha, what do you see your role as it pertains to the priesthood in the church now that all this kind of new perspective has come out?
So are you asking, do I feel like my role has changed, or?
No, it does. I mean, does it feel like it has changed in the last little bit? And if it hasn't, no matter, I'm just curious as to how you see your relationship with the priesthood, not necessarily men, but with the priesthood power.
I don't know. I feel like the priesthood is, well, I don't feel like it. I know that the priesthood power is the power of God. It's not anything that anyone else has. Like, it's not Jordan's power or my power. It's his, and that he's the one who gets to decide how and when and why it's used. And I receive all of the blessings of the priesthood just as much as anyone who has the faith to accept it, I guess. My sister, she is going through a divorce right now, and so she doesn't, so to speak, have the priesthood in her home. And I really loved the talk from last general conference during the women's session. President Nelson talked about the fact that, like, just because you don't have a priesthood holder in your home doesn't mean that you're limited. And I know that Brian, you were saying, well, like, that doesn't mean that they can give a blessing or baptize their child or like all of these other things. And I think that's a really good point. But I think that sometimes we do overlook what we have, and we're just, I don't know,
Sure,
looking for something else.
yeah,
Right.
and again, I totally agree. I don't know what the right solution is. I just know that many are dissatisfied with the answer of you have all the same blessings, but can't do the same things with the priesthood.
So let me make two final comments before we close out this discussion. One is in this podcast, again, I'm going to mention Faith Matters, Priesthood, Power of Women. It's beautiful. This lady's name was Barbara Morgan Gardner, and she's a professor at BYU, historian, incredibly smart woman. And she said, sometimes we make the mistake. She said, we define the priesthood in different ways. One, we define it as the power of God, period. The priesthood is the power of God. And then we can define it as the priesthood is the power of God given to man. And she said, what people need to realize now is that everyone has access to the power of God. Everyone has access to that priesthood. Women need to recognize they have access to that priesthood. And it was a beautiful message for me, because I feel like when you split those definitions and say, and be able to say, okay, there's this holding of the priesthood that we've always talked about. We associate priesthood with this holding of the priesthood, and it's something that we have that we can use at all times. But everyone has access to the priesthood in terms of the definition of, it is the power of God. We can all access the power of God. And I wanted to make one last comment from the talk we're actually discussing. She said this right at the end of her talk, and I thought it was a beautiful admission for her to make, because I think it acknowledges some of the pain that possibly others may feel. But she says, my personal admission today is that as a woman, I did not realize earlier in my life that I had access through my covenants to the power of the priesthood. And Tricia, you just mentioned that you work in the temple. I mean, you have accessed the power of the priesthood, and I believe that each of us do have access to that power in our lives. So anyway, thank you for being vulnerable enough to step into the limelight of the camera. We needed you desperately.
Trisha, you're wrong. You are wrong.
And I kind of want to segue out of that. Well, excuse Trisha. Thank you.
Perfect.
Segue a little bit, maybe using your last point on it being the power of God. I know that this new proclamation, and we'll probably go into this right at the end, but that new proclamation to the world on the restoration that was given at this conference a week ago. It does talk. I thought it was a really interesting point. He says that Jesus Christ was able to do what he did by the power of the Father, and essentially the power of God.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to wrap up this section right now. We spent way too long on that, but I'm so grateful Tricia jumped in. So here's the deal. Let's Zach, I want to jump into what you had from Elder Razband, and then we'll see where we're at that point. Go ahead, Zach.
Awesome. I'm almost afraid to talk now. I feel like I may have failed at my last attempt to articulate some
We all
feelings,
did.
but
I never lose,
so-
Zach. I never lose. I'm kidding.
So
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Not that it was a competition at all.
Sure. No, so in a way, however you interpret what I shared recently, I think interestingly enough, it may have a segue into this concept, which what I really appreciated, from a high level, I guess, from Brother Razband's words, and this is not the Apostle Razband, this is James R. Razband, was just highlighting, in particular, the Book of Mormon's utility in explaining specific doctrines about Christ and the atonement. And I had an experience recently that kind of threw me off, but I guess in the end helped me to try to look at the atonement in a different way, or really solidify what it means to be. So Christopher Hitchens is a pretty well-known atheist, and I was listening to a debate between him and Dave Berlinski, who's, I guess, an agnostic mathematician, and they were debating on which was more toxic, religion or atheism, I guess. Won't get too deep into that. Just wanted to highlight specifically that there was, an experience that he had, his beliefs about the atonement were pretty interesting. But let me just pull it up really quick. Sorry, guys, because it'll kind of, I guess, highlight what I appreciated from Brother Razband's talk. But since I'm not finding it right away, I'll just paraphrase it, and I think it'll be adequate for the topic. But basically, he said that he found it extremely offensive and disturbing that people would be willing to believe that their sins, that they could put their sins on somebody else, or defer, guilt or blame onto somebody else, and that because of that other person, like they were getting out scot-free, kind of. I just pulled it up. He said, "I think the teachings of Christianity are immoral." He said, "The central one is the most immoral of all. That is the one of the vicarious redemption. You can throw your sins onto somebody else." And I think that he's obviously a very intelligent person, so I don't know how deeply he's, delved into, theological concepts of atonement, but I certainly haven't ever thought of it as an excuse. And I think there's even been caution given in the history of the church, to not abuse the atonement, and to not just say, "Oh, I'll repent and be done with it. I'll knowingly, transgress and then just repent later because it's all good because Christ." So going to the notes from Brother Razband's talk specifically, he talked about that the Book of Mormon highlights the doctrine, and that Christ's atonement does satisfy the demands of justice. But he talked about Alma the Younger's experience, and how Alma felt joy despite the fact that he was guilty of leading people astray, that people had spiritually died as a result of his teachings or his efforts. And he talked about how, yes, Alma was forgiven, but his joy wasn't just because he was out and he was fine. He asked the questions, was Alma's joy focused solely on himself, on his avoiding punishment and his being able to return to the Father? We know that Alma also agonized about those whom he had led away from the truth. Alma himself could not heal and restore all those he had led away. He could not himself ensure that they would be given a fair opportunity to learn the doctrine of Christ and to be blessed by living its joyful principles. He could not bring back those who may have died, still blinded by his false teaching. President Boyd K. Packer once taught, "The thought that rescued Alma is this: restoring what you cannot restore, healing the wound you cannot heal, fixing that which you broke and you cannot fix is the very purpose of the atonement." The joyous truth on which Alma's mind caught hold was not just that he himself could be made clean, but also that those whom he had harmed could be healed and made whole. So I know that there will be a few who say that's a cop-out, it's just this blanket thing like magic. But we all know that within the church, we're taught that what accesses the atonement is faith, repentance, a broken heart, and a contrite spirit, that you pay as much of a price as you can pay to a degree to be able to access those blessings. So I just thought that was important.
And to add on that, Zach, interesting quotes that you not pulled from Razban, but from that, I can't remember the names of the two guys that were debating. But I feel like when you're really actually striving to use the atonement, it comes from a space of gratitude. And I think that's the thing that might be one of the things that is missing in his argument, is if a person is truly seeking to, they're not trying to heap sins upon another, and get off scotch-free. Rather, it comes from a place of sincere gratitude and, excitement and joy that they actually could, there's a way for us to be saved, if I could put it that way,
or to experience a measure of peace that is meaningful, real, that despite the fact that you are aware and others may be aware of your shortcomings, that you can feel this measure of peace to move on. And that you're not moving on ignorant of the damage caused, but that you can move forward whole, and that those who were in the wake of those mistakes can be made whole as well.
Yeah.
Could I say something real quick regarding just some thoughts I've had on the atonement and how it works, grace versus works, all that great debate between LDS Mormon Christians and other denominations. Really, what I have found that it comes down to is time. And if I could explain that, what I mean by time is the moment. Any given moment, can we serve two masters? And the New Testament suggests that we cannot. I think what it means by that is that it's not like we're serving one master for years and then serving another master for the rest, another few decades. I believe at any given moment we can, the brain can only focus on one thing at a time. And a lot of people say, well, I can multitask. The fact is, with those that can multitask really well, they can jump back and forth between focus super, super well. They've honed in that skill, whether it be by default or otherwise. And I find that the atonement in my—
Whose phone is that?
It's probably mine. I don't know.
It's loud.
It's always Jordan.
There it goes again. It's
It's loud.
But yeah, I apologize. I'll try to turn it off. But I think it has to do with that, because it really, when it comes down to grace and our acceptance of Christ's grace and his saving actions, it seems like at any given moment we can accept that or not. And if we didn't accept it at one point, the very next moment we can accept it again, And what I believe that means is just focusing on the next right thing. And that's kind of an Eastern religious thought as well. It's just that in Siddhartha, this book that I recently read, the river flows and it comes from one place and goes to another, but consistently it goes over the same rock and it's always the same. So there's a timeless factor, I feel like, that's often overlooked in the atonement. If that makes any sense, we can go into that in another episode.
Yeah. So Jordan, first, I'm gonna mute you real fast until you can figure out how to turn off that chime. So yeah, a couple quick thoughts. So in regards to the atonement, I will say, I have several friends who kind of struggle with anxiety and depression, and a friend of mine, as I was kind of trying to understand the challenges that he was going through, he just simply said, like, I cannot motivate myself to do anything, to get a different job, to get educated. And so he's he feels like he's constantly in a state of stagnance, right? And I will say that this idea of the atonement and making mistakes and then growing from them, I don't know, I have challenges with it because, if someone struggles to drive change in their life, a lot of times it's not their fault, right? A lot of it's based on the biology that they were given. I will also say that I think that the way that Christianity describes the rebirth and the cleansing process that happens through the atonement is also experienced non-religiously, right? If you I've heard what's that guy's name, David Coggins, his story about being 300 pounds and becoming a Navy SEAL, and now he wakes up at 2:00 in the morning and exercises for 6 hours a day. If you described without religious words what the atonement does and happens, I would guess that he would say, yeah, that's exactly what I went through, right? And this, so I will say, I think there are a lot of ways outside of Christianity and Mormonism that people experience a rebirth and making a mistake and feeling bad about it, and then deciding I'm going to be different, I am going to grow, and then feeling a success afterwards, which is exactly kind of what the atonement is just without the idea of a savior at the center of the process. So, I think it's a very beautiful doctrine. But from a kind of non-religious standpoint, I think that a lot of the benefits gained, people who are non-religious also gain. They just don't place the idea of a savior in the middle of that process.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you feel like people are reaping benefits of making mistakes, feeling guilt, and improving for next time, and getting, and feeling better as a result of that, even outside of a religious context, is kind of what I'm gathering.
Yeah. I mean, I'm it's suggested that because I don't go to church all that often and don't pray and don't read the scriptures, that I'm under the influence of Satan, but yet I still feel all of the healing powers of making mistake and changing, and then feeling a wholeness after I've been able to get rid of a bad mistake that I did before when I was believing. So, I think it's, everyone experiences it if they are able to feel guilt and decide to make a change and grow. It's just, the Church of Jesus Christ places obviously Jesus Christ at the center of that process. So just kind of a different take to the same kind of change mechanism and healing process.
I think Jordan has
Beautiful.
something he wants to say.
Yeah, he's still muted.
Sorry,
there
Jordan.
he is.
There you
is.
go.
Jordan, go ahead.
I think I turned my phone off. In response to Brian's last comment, that scripture comes to mind that I think is a lot more merciful than it sounds, that basically says every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is the Christ. In my experience with some of the very humble, salt of the earth, addicts, homeless, those kind of characters, I find that many of them do not believe in Jesus Christ, but they believe in a higher power that seems to give them access to a happiness that they otherwise would not have, be able to access on their own or even with other human beings. And even the Taoists would suggest that there's this fine line that's like a kind of a straight and narrow path between chaos and order, in which, if you follow, that is the way, so to speak. And I just find that however people access this power, whatever it may be, that makes them happier, my hope is that eventually we do find out what that was, and that there's a spiritual realm that we might not be able to see right now, but many people actually have access to, including many prominent atheists. I know that, Sam Harris believes that, you can be guided spiritually without actually acknowledging that it's a deity, God. But I find that it is my hope that we can eventually get to that point where we see who or what it is. And in my experience or my belief, my faith belief is that is Jesus Christ. And if that scripture is true, I think many people will confess, and knees will bow, and they will recognize that's who it was. It was Jesus Christ helping me all along, even though I didn't say it was Jesus Christ. I'm totally willing to give him the credit now that I see him.
And that was something that, oh, go ahead, Brian.
Well, I guess to push back one more time, is it impossible to believe that it's just part of human nature, right? Meaning, I think it's fairly well agreed upon that the humanity and animal species see pain and suffering as bad, and happiness and joy as good, right? And psychologically, if someone does something that causes themselves or others pain and doesn't want that experience anymore, makes a change that drives happiness and joy, that whole thing just happened based on just base level human psychology. So I guess my one pushback is, it for me, my goal is that everybody experiences as much joy and happiness and fulfillment in this life as possible. Those religious believe that Jesus Christ is the center of that. Those that are non-religious believe that, that there's a number of ways that it can happen, just general human psychology. But I think at the end of the day, the importance is that everybody feels the healing, the joy, the happiness, the fulfillment that life has to offer.
Zach, go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that's totally valid. I mean, I mean, in my experience with these conversations, it's just so hard for anybody to like slam dunk something, right? I mean, you might catch
That was a slam dunk. That was a slam dunk.
Right.
That was an
Right.
Aaron Gordon, Orlando Magic, behind the back, under the legs, 360 slam dunk backflip, undercover
I think Aaron
rover.
Gordon might have been a bad example. He is, I think unjustified. He's 0 for 2 in the slam dunk contest, so he has been unsuccessful in being the best at that. But so I guess what I'm saying is, I really do appreciate these different perspectives, because again, I was listening to that podcast with Eric Weinstein and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and they made a comment, and I don't know if this is what they intended, and maybe later on in the podcast they clarify and give their own explanation for it. But they talked about, that what humans are capable of doing is scary, and that it's a miracle that every day we don't have somebody like blow themselves up and kill people, or like that there's so much mental distress and things like that really impact everybody's quality of life. And there have been these deeds that have been done in isolated instances. Like they gave the example of, there was some random guy who used a drone with a small explosive. I don't remember what the story is, and people will know what I'm talking about. But apparently he shot some government facility with this explosive. It was and it was connected to a bunch of explosives, and it like blew up
a munitions factory. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so a military facility with drones. They said, we knew that something was going to happen with drones. And they mentioned that there's this odd, they said, we've had incredible luck. That it's a miracle that like the worst has not happened. What could happen, the worst that could happen hasn't happened. Granted, there's still plenty of atrocities that have happened that, we don't really have to think too hard to think of. But people define this balance between chaos and order, the reality that the world as we know it hasn't just collapsed in front of us, whether that be in terms of the physical reality around us, or the, and I know that we live a very privileged life. We haven't had the type of, government issues and political problems that many people experience throughout the world. What I'm getting at, though, is, this belief that, I have, that Christ is with us in every step of our life. So Brian, even in an instance where it might be believed that because you're not doing certain things that you're exposed to temptation or what have you, that, in the grand scheme of things, like that stage doesn't even matter. It only matters, which direction you're going. And that's kind of the point, because we can't all get to the same finish line. Like we just don't have the same abilities or the same talents, and we acknowledge that not everybody's the same, and some people may be so overwhelmed with anxiety in this life that they just can't get themselves to do some things that matter. But that does not make them irredeemable. And I know that it's a convenient thing to say, but it's a different experience when it becomes not wishful thinking to you on a personal level. And that's just my experience. And I would just say that it is a remarkable belief that you believe that you are not alone. I don't say that to be dramatic or oversimplify things, but that is a fundamental belief that I have. So yeah, I just think that there's somebody who's with us, and that they sustain us in every season of life.
Zach, is that your belief that it is good to know that for you, or that it is beneficial for everybody to know that for themselves?
The latter.
I guess to contradict that point, I feel like I experience more peace in my life knowing that I could be alone, and that every day is precious. So, and again, it kind of goes back to our conversation last week about, it's not dangerous to talk about personal truths, but when you start generalizing what is best for other people and for them to believe, that can get a little dicey. But yeah, I from a contradictory standpoint, I feel like I have more of a healthy mindset believing the opposite of that. So yeah.
So here we are, with two people who believe that they have the healthy mindset, right? And I guess maybe my perspective seems less genuine just because I'm projecting it onto other people, right? And I'm going to say, right, with what I have, what I'm going to say, I'm not going to say that I've seen Christ, or that he's actually appeared in front of me and said something. But I would ask Brian specifically, let's say that tomorrow you wake up, and I know that you've talked about this before from an agnostic point of view, but let's say that Christ appeared to you and said, this is the way, whatever it is, right? Maybe it's not even what I think, right? And he says, this is the way, and this is the way for everyone. How would you convince people that that was true?
I don't know.
Why would it be difficult?
Well, if me telling my experience to someone else and them telling my experience to someone else, each level gets one level distance, more removed from the actual baseline experience.
Sure.
But I mean, going back to kind of your thought about, you think it's important that other people experience this belief that they're not alone, and that this is all not just happenstance and chance, right? That we're all alive. Well, yeah, and I know that's not necessarily what you meant, and I'm misrepresenting, but I would push back and say that it is beneficial to believe that there is a higher order to life if you have not accepted the reality of eventual death. But once you come to peace with the fact that you are here for a moment and you will die, and that death could be tomorrow, and that's okay, the benefit of peace that you feel with a higher power no longer serves as much of a purpose when you have come to acceptance of that reality.
And I think that's a beautiful thought, honestly. And I've heard that a few times from different people who say, like, you know what, if I am alone and I am in a non-divine speck of consciousness, in this gigantic universe, then I'm fine with that. And I think that is beautiful. In the same way that it is beautiful, I don't think that you can only have that thought and that appreciation without a religious perspective. I mean, many times,
Sure.
even in the scriptures, it talks about your insignificance compared to the greatness of God, right? And I guess in your way, you're saying that there's a great universe out there, a great big higher level of being, that maybe you will attain, maybe you won't, but for now you have right now. And I think that concept is huge, and I think that I would do well to have that more present in the front of my mind, but I don't think that by doing that I have to sacrifice religious belief.
Yeah,
to enjoy it that
Absolutely.
way.
I totally agree. Again, I think it's the benefits of these beliefs are extremely helpful, regardless if they come through a religious mindset or not. And for many, it is easier to come to these benefits through religion than not. It's harder to do it without religion. But yeah, Jordan. Sorry.
Jordan, your phone went off, Jordan, and it was a beacon that you needed to speak. Go.
And you're on mute for another 5 minutes.
No, sorry. I would argue that acceptance, that it is a beautiful concept, because and I would argue that is the atonement from my perspective, and what I was talking about when it came to the moment and accepting His grace in the moment. That's what I mean, is that when you can, at least in my experience, when I can just accept what is right now and carry on with a faith, or you could say a trust that the powers that be, in my case, the atonement of Jesus Christ, will take care of the future, the anxiety goes away. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, Brian, a little bit, just that if I can just accept that here I am, there's imperfections, I'm here for a brief moment, and whatever will be, and things will play out. I believe that from my understanding of Jesus Christ and His atonement, that's basically what He's saying. He's saying, consider the lilies, how they grow. They don't toil nor do they spin. The birds of the sky, they totally trust that God will take care of them. And you could say, whether God is a personage or not, there is a higher power that is collective or not, that is giving us oxygen, that is giving us this brief moment in time on earth. And by accepting that and not trying to control it, it really brings a peace. And I kind of, that's how I see the atonement. I define it. It's semantics, but I define it. That's my
the ding of the bell is your time.
So Jordan, what you're saying is we believe in the same thing. You just call it the atonement and Jesus Christ. I just call it just basic human psychology. We believe in the same thing. We just place a different label on it.
Yeah, and I think by accepting that, hopefully we'll eventually find out. But accepting it is the key. I think that's the grace in which we can accept. It is perhaps semantics, but
the beauty of what you just discovered, though, is the fact that we're all so similar. And I think sometimes we get into maybe a disagreement on whether you're religious or not, when in reality, we're all seeking for more understanding and more light and knowledge as time goes on. And for the most part, I hope that even prominent, very intelligent atheists of the world, down the road, if there is God, are wise enough to recognize, I was wrong on that. I can, you know what I mean? And make a shift. Because I am a believer that people are genuinely trying their best to be good. And I believe in progression in this life and also after this life. So And anyway, I have nothing else to add. I feel like all of your thoughts were succinct and smarter than mine. All y'all, open up your official proclamation regarding the restoration. Have that open in front of you, and let's wrap up our discussions tonight with let's wrap up our discussions tonight with this big, huge announcement.
Big, huge announcement, meaning we proclaim the things that we already believe, that we already said, but now we're proclaiming it.
I declare bankruptcy. All right.
Great episode.
I probably just woke up all my kids. Okay, so the restoration of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this was like, I feel like what was supposed to be a big part of, the excitement and bubbling around General Conference. For those that don't know, this is like the 200-year anniversary, the bicentennial anniversary of the first vision, which is, the vision that Joseph Smith had in the sacred grove of God the Father and Jesus Christ. And so that's what, that's where it all began for Mormonism. And I feel like this discussion could be very interesting because we lay a lot of weight on this particular event. And, you'll see in here, inside of this proclamation, our claim that it is the New Testament church restored. So let's maybe go. Zach, did you have any particular paragraph you wanted to start on as we launch into this? Maybe we can read it and then just discuss it.
Yeah. So I also would like to maybe
the whole
just
thing, or
we're just gonna highlight some stuff. I mean, this is fortunately a one-pager. I think it looks like roughly 7 paragraphs, so we should be able to hop around pretty effectively. But I am surprised because we have been discussing this as a group. We've actually had a filming of an episode where we specifically just tried to treat the first vision. And the timing of this, I think, was so great. For anybody who thinks critically about the story of the first vision, I'm genuinely surprised that Brian seems to not have an interest in it, only from the perspective of, there's a lot that people have said to interpret the first vision. And a lot of times it's like, well, we don't know like if it's official. We don't know what tenets like the church is like holding fast to. And then lo and behold, we have this proclamation. It's official documentation, which makes a lot of that guesswork disappear because on this document, it could be, I think this is as good as new scripture. And I think that was even explained with the solemn assembly happening, where they're going to put this forward. And it means basically like, we're going to say something here that we are explicitly willing to be held accountable for.
Yep. So Zach, I guess question is, what was in question as to whether the church believed it or not? Are there specific topics in here that were in question as to whether the church believed it or didn't?
Yeah, one thing that Spencer brought up in our previous discussion was he's like, is it the 200th memorial? Because we have some, historical documentation or perspectives that say, maybe it was in Joseph's 16th year or 15th year, and that would shift the dates. And yet, the church is saying, hey, this is the 200th anniversary, and it specifically says 200 years ago on a beautiful spring morning in 1820. Joseph Smith, New York, USA, basically doubling down on, when this happened. I just think that that's one example. Again, a lot of the
is there anything material though? I don't care whether it's 201 or 199. That's not. I don't think that really matters. And is there anything substantial doctrine that was in question?
So, again, with the different versions of the first vision, the different primary accounts, there have been some, maybe these things, maybe I made an incorrect assumption that these discrepancies mattered to you at all.
And maybe they matter more to me, right? Because if I'm being vulnerable, this is where my crisis of faith began, right? which honestly is something I celebrate now, and we can get into that in different episodes. But for me, it began with the first vision, because I sat and read. To answer your question, Brian, is there anything materially different in these, in the different accounts of the first vision? Well, yeah, in my opinion, you could read that first account that happened in, what was it, 1832?
Yeah, the
Was when
1832 account.
when he first wrote down the first vision, and we can dissect these in greater depth in a later episode, but in that one, it's difficult to see if there's any distinction between God the Father appearing and Jesus Christ. And there's some debate on that. And I've listened to, many people on the apologetic side, as well as many people on the other side. But for me, when I read it for the first time, that 1832 account, it was a very hard pill to swallow.
Mm.
Because I'm sitting there and saying that, it essentially says, the Lord opened the heavens and I saw the Lord, and, goes on to say, forgave his sins. So when I read something like right here that, we solemnly proclaim that God loves his children in every nation. Wait, that's not where it was. But it says,
in
that
humility,
God,
we declare, third paragraph down.
Thank you. In humility, we declare that in answer to his prayer, God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to Joseph and inaugurated the restitution of all things.
And which account is that from? Is that from the 1838 account?
1832 is the account I was just discussing, where it says, the Lord opened the heavens and I saw the Lord. So the earliest account,
Sure,
the closest one written to that particular time.
but which one aligns with their proclamation? Is it the 1838 account?
1838, the one that's canonized.
So has that ever not been the accepted message?
I think within the church, that's been the dominant narrative forever.
Yeah,
and I think that's the controversy.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, Brian, is this is boring because this is old news. We've been
this
teaching this as missionaries forever.
Yeah, this is already the approved message that people have been behind for decades, right? Or, hundreds of years at this point. So I don't think it's anything new or different, really.
The reason I thought it would be relevant to you, though, was because, and again, this is just in the interest of, I guess, consistency with the conversations that we've already had. I mean, Brian, you've made the comment on a couple of occasions that you feel like that the church has made reactive decisions, where they have made concessions to apparent critiques of, particularly like women's role in the church, blacks in the priesthood, polygamy. And I think that is something that you've paid attention to. And here we have an example where, despite increasing awareness about the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated, and then these varying accounts of the first vision, instead of in this paragraph saying, sometime in the early 1800s, Joseph Smith went into the grove, right? No, quite the opposite. That instead of making any concession to, I guess, allow a broader window of the historical account to be true, it's saying that there were specific elements that were in fact omitted in other accounts, and that is simply just being declared as it was a non-necessary omission. Yeah, that it wasn't a thing.
So I don't see this as consequential. I still see it as reactive from the church, because there's no way to prove otherwise that it wasn't 200 years ago exactly. I mean, essentially the church is doing exactly what Lance Armstrong did when people started coming after him and saying, wow, you're a doper. And he took those people to court and sued them, right? He doubled down on his position that he was clean. And I think that's, I don't know. I don't.
But I think that with Lance Armstrong, he's doing that because it's either you deny it or you accept the derision. Whereas with the church, like, their back isn't against the wall. Like, they don't have to put out this proclamation. Like, they could, as many have criticized them of doing, just go business as usual and not even address it. Some people have said that the church has taken that stance on a couple of issues until it's like forced upon them. And it seems that they're willing to make a statement about what they believe, even when it's not exactly even being asked of them.
So I think to sum up Zach's point is just, he's saying that this is an interesting document because the church is coming out and saying straightforward, this is what happened, despite all the other variations and versions. This is what happened. And I mean, a lot of people outside and inside the church could probably see this as a very bold statement from the church.
Well, this is my point, is this is exactly what the church has been saying all along. They're just saying it they're just proclaiming it a little more boldly, putting different packaging around it and making it a missionary tool.
Yeah. So I will continue with this idea, though, that because it is an official proclamation, right? Before they had like the gospel topics essays that were, on the LDS website somewhere, you could go read that kind of perspective where you could actually see the varying different accounts. Do any of you guys, were any of you guys challenged by different accounts of the first vision? And we don't need to go into too much depth here.
We'll have an entire episode on this, I think, because you said it was a hard pill to swallow. After reading all 4 of them, I don't see much contradiction, to be quite frank.
Yeah, which is amazing. You know what I mean? That you and I can read them and have a completely different reaction, right?
Yeah.
To those two things, and that's the reality. Is, for me, it's the 1832 account. The 1832 account feels very out of place and different for me. The rest of them, I could totally agree with you, Jordan. I could say, yeah, whatever. 2 personages, other angels, I'm fine with that. You know what I mean? Like, it's a vision. When I feel the semblance of a very important doctrine, which is God the Father and Jesus Christ are 2 separate beings, and they both were there.
Yeah,
that's a very important thing.
Yeah, but he never, in the 1832 account, he doesn't specify that there was only one there.
So Jordan,
I don't see a contradiction.
I don't think I think we all agree there's no contradiction. The concern is that there is, I would say, substantial variance in the message from the varying different. It was
a missing puzzle piece. Like, I'm putting together a puzzle and I was missing the face of God. And I was like, where's that one?
Yeah. But in relation to the proclamation, though, I mean, it didn't even come up as a thought for me, because I mean, the 1838 account is always the Father and the Son appearing to Joseph Smith has always been the church accepted version of the first vision.
Here's what I think is the beauty of all of this, because I hope I don't come across as too pessimistic on this particular topic. The only reason I bring it up is because it is a sticking point and a pain point for people. And, we could sit here and deny that it's painful for some people to look at a proclamation document and say, oh my goodness, like, I've just learned about these multiple accounts. Some of them have variations that make it hard for me, and now it's almost official scripture, that it's this particular way and we're not going to budge from that stance. And so all I want to validate is, if it wasn't a difficult topic already, then we wouldn't be having this discussion, And so to validate other people's experiences with that is important. I think in trying to understand one another will be far better to recognize that people have varying experiences with the same information. And that should be validated, not quieted, and anyway, I have nothing else to say about that. And we can do a whole episode on first vision and digging into, variances or differences as we go along there, because I think that'll be an interesting topic down the road. Anything else, Zach, you wanted to say as it pertains to to this particular proclamation?
Oh, so like we're wrapping up the proclamation right now?
Well, no, I think we should. I want to keep going, through what other things the proclamation said. So we've
Yeah.
said, we read that third paragraph, that God the
Right.
Father and his Son appeared to Joseph, inaugurated the restitution of all things as
Yeah.
foretold in the Bible. Do you want
And
to
then
read another paragraph there?
Well, I'm curious because it seemed like you had a particular interest in the next sentence, I think, where he says, in his vision, he learned that following the death of the original apostles, Christ's New Testament church was lost, referencing specifically his New Testament church, and that this church is the restoration of that same church. So what thoughts did you have specifically with that usage of that descriptor for the church?
I thought it was interesting, right? I don't think I've ever heard them refer to, well, I mean, I'm sure I've heard them say the New Testament church. I know on my mission many times I said they restored Christ's church. Christ established a church, and then, Christ's church was restored. And I'd have to look at the phraseology inside of Preach My Gospel now. It's been a while, but I think it is the claim. Right? So let me ask the question, because many churches and religions around the world make big claims that they are either a restoration or the only true, and what was nice for me on this was, this idea of restoring Christ's New Testament church. They didn't use the phraseology of, Christ's one true, you know what I mean? I don't know. It did feel a little softer for me in terms of, drawing some kind of hard line. Having said that, they're still making a bold claim that this is the New Testament church, and we have continuing revelation within this church, and, all of those things. But I'm rambling now. So does someone want to take the reins as it pertains to Zach's question?
Save Spencer.
So in my opinion, the proclamation is the language of the proclamation is external facing as a message to people outside of the church regarding this is what we believe. So, in terms of calling it, the New Testament church, it's interesting. That's kind of what we already believed, right? There's no change there. It's just, I do think, some of the interesting parts of this might be the language is external facing to that generally accepted language of people who accept Christianity, rather than language within the Mormon faith. So, yeah.
Sure, that makes sense. One thing that I thought was interesting is just the dynamic in the following paragraph where it says, we affirm that under the direction of the Father and the Son, which is just interesting, again, talking about like the division between those two individuals, and that there is some, division of roles and communication, and that's all part of, I guess, Joseph's tutelage in being the one who was bringing back this New Testament church.
The peace and quiet after your statement, Zach, is beautiful.
Wow, that must have been really powerful.
You dropped
or really dry.
Powerful or boring.
So it continues, and I think we should do a whole episode on the priesthood, but talks about the restoration of the priesthood through John the Baptist, and then the apostles Peter, James, and John, which I think would be a fascinating thing to discuss. And then talks about, the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, and its translation. I mean, really, like Brian's saying, as you read this, it could be used, I'm sure this will be on pamphlets at some point that are being handed out by missionaries. And, it's a very succinct way of sharing our particular message that, the Church of Jesus Christ has been restored. We are that church. Do I have any particular, a major stance on this? I'm working through my journey, right? So my opinions now on the show will probably be different, 3 years down the road on the show when we have at least 1,000 subscribers. But like, so I'm really open to like this shift in my beliefs over time as it pertains to this. Sometimes, it is hard. Do you guys find it hard?
That's what she said.
Yeah, thank you. Do you guys find it difficult? There, I'm going to change the phrasing. Difficult to accept really strong claims of one, that we are the New Testament church. Is that hard for any of you? And Brian, you may have some comments here, but Zach and Jordan, have you ever wrestled with that idea? Looking at the world as a whole and saying, okay, we're such a small, like, finite fraction of the planet Earth, and we're making pretty big statements here about being the New Testament church. Is that itchy to you guys at all, or is it something you feel very comfortable and confident and certain about?
Yeah, I'm. See, it's weird because I don't find any theological, or you could even say organizational, discrepancy, given what Jesus Christ taught. The only thing that I could see as maybe a possible discrepancy would be the institution of the church being a little bit more corporate than what Jesus Christ set up. He was a little bit more vagabond, go around, serve people, and perform miracles. And that's how I would hope that we could all see the church and see the gospel, because there's a slight difference between the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not a slight, there's a big difference, I think, between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the institution that administers that gospel. And we currently are in a time in history where maybe the most effective way to administer that gospel is via a corporate style institution. But the actual gospel, I don't really see any discrepancy between the New Testament gospel as taught by Jesus Christ and the one taught by the LDS faith, to be honest.
Yeah. Zach?
Sorry. Absolutely. Like I was actually reading my journal entries from my mission, and I referenced this in one of our previous episodes, where I had said that I struggled for the first couple days in the MTC, kind of coming to grips with what I was telling people, what that meant. I mean, I think that there's a couple of things that I think that I wish people would be more readily willing to acknowledge, and that is that not every religious person, not every active religious person has never grappled with their own faith, right? Mm-hmm. And not every non-religious person, has no allowance for, faith or the unexplainable, right? I wish that those two stereotypes would kind of go away. I mean, not to say that they don't exist, right? I think that, each person's story is so long. It would take me forever to read those journal excerpts to maybe illustrate just how challenging it was for me and the thoughts that I had. And just like you said, Spencer, like just dealing with the absoluteness of the message of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I mean, there's just so much there that just says yeah, this is it. Despite all of the ridiculous odds of what we know, the probabilities and all that, are you really going to put your flag in the ground for this?
Right.
And, I have my own feelings about just this, the postmodern approach of, there's a million different possibilities. So I feel very uncomfortable with making one statement. I think that today people are so afraid to do that. And I think that's, I'm not saying that they're all nihilistic and that if you don't believe in something that your life's not worth living, like, but I do think that we shouldn't be so apprehensive about believing in something.
Mhm.
And being willing to be like, you know what, I believe this. And I'm sure that there are people who, I mean, it might be semantics, right? Like someone who's like, this is what I think, this is my opinion. I guess it's a form of belief that, you have certain evidences that are part of what you say you think the world and the reality is made up of. Man, I'm just talking way too much, guys. And I'm sorry that it's maybe not delivering for some, but yes, absolutely. It's hard to grapple with that at times, but I guess
I love what you said though, Zach, in that it it needs to be a less of a taboo topic to be able to grapple with, you know, with the absoluteness of it. I think if we were more open to discuss issues of whether it's faith in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or struggling with the first vision and this whole, how all of this came about, um, it would bode well for many people who are going through that wrestle.
of
But
course.
you were finishing a thought. Go
Yeah.
ahead,
No,
Zach.
and I'll just wrap it up now. I mean, I just think that it, and man, it is so hard having some of these conversations because we could dive into so many specific elements of each thing and really kind of dig into why, you see the end result of who we are today. And of course, all of that is subject to change, but I guess there are certain elements of my beliefs, testimony, convictions, whatever you want to call it, to where there are some aspects of the gospel, elements to the message of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that as uncomfortable as it would be for me to say that 1 + 1 is not 2, me saying, I it would be disingenuous of me to say that I don't believe or don't know some things. And I
Mhm.
know that I know that that's a very problematic thing to say.
No,
But
not at all.
for some people to hear somebody say like I know or I believe, it 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 doesn't ring true to them, and that's totally fine. I get that.
I
And I
believe
don't.
is good.
Yeah,
Sure, no,
I
right.
don't
So
think
you
there's
say
any I don't think there's any issue with saying I believe at all. I
right,
don't
but
think so.
I right. So, but what I'm getting at though is that I would say, um, I would say more than that in
Right.
some things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I guess my thoughts on the truth claim and how I feel about it. I struggle with truth claims when where there's no way to prove whether it's actually true, right? And outside of Mormonism, I mean, think about someone, writing up a scientific paper and claiming, something contrary to, the general theory of relativity, but having no way to measure it or or test whether it's true or false. I mean, you would just be laughed at, right? Um, I believe a lot of people believe that they believe, um, and that's okay. I mean, at the end of the day, the goal is: does it make my life better to believe in this, or does it make my life worse? And I think whether we believe in this being the true church or we don't, I don't think it really matters as long as there is a increase in joy and fulfillment and a decrease in pain and suffering. So, but I mean, from an agnostic standpoint, yeah, I certainly struggle with the truth claim because there's no way to prove that it's true. And, I know I've said this a number of times, the church teaches that if you pray about it and feel something good, that's a testimony that it's true. But we know that we're extremely susceptible to being duped by our own psyche. So yeah, I do struggle with that a lot. But at the end of the day, I don't think about it all that much because if my life is getting better, whether or not I believe it, I'm already achieving my end result. For me, it doesn't matter how I got there.
Jordan.
I don't really have too much more to say other than, yeah, I guess there are certain, when it comes to truth, we're going to have an episode on this, because the truth claims that I think the members of the church are making, at least the truth claim that I would make whenever I would say I know or I don't know, is based upon a perhaps semantic definition of what the truth is or feels like, or what proof is. And we can go into that in that episode. So, and there are many things that really, really resonate. And a lot of them aren't connected or necessarily adopted solely by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they resonate as true. And what I mean by true, we'll go into. So yeah, I don't really have any follow-up on that, other than there are certain things that resonate that are just goodness. And it's like I can't really disagree or agree with what Brian and Zach were saying, because I think there's an entire discussion to be had.
Yeah. Well, wonderful, guys. I wanted to close with this, just the very end of this proclamation, which says, "We gladly declare that the promised restoration goes forward through continuing revelation. The earth will never again be the same, as God will gather together all things one in Christ." I really do actually love this message of continuing revelation that is being more actively shared, because I feel like it gets away from making specific claims, drawing hard lines in the sand. And then when those hard lines get, crossed, people can look back and say, "Oh, you see, you said this one thing and you were wrong." You know what I mean? And people can do that, from an antagonistic position against the church. You can easily look back at the church and say, "Look how many times you were wrong." But I do like the idea of, one, this is an organization run by humans that are seeking to develop relationships with God and Christ. And as a result, it's messy. And this is a continuing revelation, which in other words is a fancy way of saying, we are constantly seeking further light and knowledge. And when that comes, we will change. We're going to change. So stop thinking that we won't. And that to me is beautiful, because that's how I feel like my life is. You know what I mean? Like, it's a perfect parallel to my life and the way that I will change over time. I don't lock myself into one particular belief, because reality is that has a possibility of changing and becoming stronger and better and more sound over time. So those are my final thoughts. Anything you guys want to add before we wrap up?
I'm proud of you all.
Did you say love you all?
I'm proud of you all.
Oh, proud of us. Okay. But do you love us?
Love is a difficult concept to describe, but yes, I do believe the thing that is described as love most frequently is something that is felt from me to you.
Thanks.
Oh,
all right. That's a wrap. I miss you guys, man. I am so done being freaking quarantined.
Oh man.
Guys, quarantine.
Let's just get together and cough and sneeze on each other. Ryan.
Quarantine with 4 kids under the age of 7, and then call me, dude.
Oh.
Yeah.
Jordan, I will say that the Utah County is now the second highest kind of new cases of coronavirus in Utah, just behind Salt Lake County. and we're getting closer every day to Salt Lake County. And my hypothesis is that there are a number of selfish single people in their 20s and early 30s who are unable
Still
to
hanging out
spend
together.
to be alone. So yeah, would love to get together with you guys, but
isolated already.
my circle is tight right now, and you guys are
Yeah.
not in it.
Okay. Well, I guess you don't love us. That's all right. That's cool.
I love you from a distance.
All right, boys.
From a
Awesome.
distance.
Have a good night, guys.
All right.
See ya.